Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer Tucker. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Community and Regional Planning, and I'm so excited to invite you to this panel, Defund Imagining Police-Free Futures. We'll start with the land recognition. Today, UNM we know is on Tiwa land. The indigenous peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, Apache, Comanche, Ute, Sardo, and others have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the region's vitality and economy. We honor that legacy and the people who remain protectors and stewards. Here at CRP, we have a commitment to Indigenous education. We recognize Indigenous people's resilience in the face of violent dispossession of land and culture, and we're committed to dismantling settler colonialism through planning, education, and research. So I just am so excited that there are so many of you here today with us for this important conversation as we reimagine community safety and well-being beyond policing and prisons. There were 77 folks registered. There's 50 of us here together. We can't see each other, which is a total bummer, but know that you are in good company. And I just am so excited about the 4 movement leaders who will be in dialogue today. We'll hear more about them in just a second. I just want to let folks know that this is a panel that is hosted and organized by a group of students in one of my classes, the Foundations of Community Development. And it's also co-sponsored by the abolitionist collective, The People's Budget. And I'm excited to be here because I've been an activist and an educator working on issues around decarceration and abolition since 2015, since I was pulled in as an ally to support the movement for Black Lives in Oakland. And I've been teaching a class called Policing the City since 2015, and have learned so much from frontline communities and social movements about how we can reimagine community care, well-being, thinking about how we can build communities where everybody thrives. So we have lots of reasons to celebrate today. We're a year out of an unprecedented uprising against police brutality and racism. There have been really big wins. Just getting this word, this provocative, perhaps controversial word, defund, into the political conversation is huge. This was unimaginable just a few years ago. Here in Albuquerque, we have a new Department of Community Safety to send unarmed social workers to non-emergency calls. And I'm also here with a heavy heart because we're also living amid a law and order backlash to these really powerful social movements. So just last spring, here in Albuquerque, the mayor decided to increase the police budget to $222 million. Here at the state level, Michelle Lujan Gershom is proposing to invest $100 million in policing and prisons. That's $100 million that's not going to go to education, healthcare, public lands, or climate adaptation. So this is heartbreaking, but it's not that surprising because the language, logics, and common sense of policing is so mainstream and dominates our public discourse, which is why our conversation today is so crucial. For the last 50 years, we've seen a dramatic expansion of policing in prisons alongside the criminalization of poverty. And we've seen that law and order solutions become the kind of go-to response to a whole range of social problems, including economic inequality. So today we're here to elevate critical scholarship and the wisdom of social movements. And we're grounding our discussion today in an abolitionist framework. So I just want to say a few things about that. So from the abolitionist perspective, prisons and policings are institutions that produce harm and violence. They do not produce safety. So we define the police as the institution authorized to use violence to maintain a deeply unequal social order. In an important New York Times editorial, the organizer Marian Kaba wrote, it's called we mean literally abolish the police. There's a link to it in a set of resources you'll get at the end. She says there has not been a single era in US history in which the police were not a force of violence used against Black people. We could add Indigenous and other groups as well. Policing in the South emerged from slave patrols. In the North, the first municipal police departments helped quash labor strikes and riots against the rich. Everywhere, the police suppressed marginalized populations to protect the status quo. So also this abolitionist, so while the abolitionist framework has this important social critique, it is also a hope-filled ethical stance about how we can live together. Ruth Wilson Gilmore gives us this important abolitionist principle where life is precious, life is precious. This way of seeing helps us ask different kinds of questions that can lead us to different futures. We can ask, why do we have enough money for policing and prisons, but not enough for education? And the defund movement insists that budgets are a statement of values and wants us to invest in life-giving social relationships instead of life-taking institutions. The abolitionist approach also insists that we separate and analytically distinguish crime and harm. We're deeply concerned about harm and reparations for harm, but we actually know that many crimes actually don't create harm. And many harms, we could think about harms to the environment, all sorts of harms actually don't count as crimes. So we're here today to expand our political imaginations and think together, dream about the futures we can build together. We'll welcome your questions in the Q&A function. You're welcome to start thinking about those now. We hope this is a space of political education. And I also just want to say, like, if you're here and your gut is telling you, wait a second, the police make me feel safe. Or if you're thinking like, oh, wait a second, without police, there'd be anarchy in the streets. We want to say, we're so glad you're here. And we want to extend a special invitation to really listen and cultivate openness to the expertise of the folks on this panel who have been engaged in this work for quite a long time. So with that, I will turn it over to Hally, who will introduce our speakers.
Hi, I'm Hally, and I'm going to help today by moderating the panel. I'm a student in the CRP, the UNM Community and Regional Planning Program. And I had the pleasure of being in this class with Dr. Tucker and my peers here who are facilitating this talk. And just a note that there is a live transcription of this event. So if you would like to have closed captioning, you can enable that if that makes your experience here easier. Today we'll hear from each panelist about their work and how they are imagining and embodying police-free futures. And after we hear from them individually, we'll have a more collective conversation. And so we'll be taking questions after we hear from each of these speakers. So firstly, we'll hear from Richard Moore, who is the program director at Los Jardines Institute and a founding member of the Chicano Black Berets organization. Then we will hear from David Correia, a professor of American Studies here at UNM and a founding member of the research collective Abolish APD. And we'll hear from Szu-Han Ho, who is an associate professor of art and ecology and a founding member of the Los Fronteristas and about abolitionist art collective. And lastly, we'll hear from Justin Allen, who is a formerly incarcerated abolition activist and organizer with the People's Budget. So without further ado, we'll pass it to Richard to kick us off. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Hally. And I just wanted to thank the organizers, particularly thank the students that have made it possible for us to engage in this discussion this evening. I just wanted to begin my comments just to go back and identify some benchmarks that are crucial in terms of understanding police repression and the results of that police repression and their activities during that time. So I'm going to very quickly identify some key benchmarks. One, I think it's crucial for us to understand that life didn't begin when we began. So in my brief comments, then we're looking at hundreds upon hundreds of years of systemic racism. That's what this discussion is engaged in, and the protectors of corporations and through US governments or through county, city, state, or federal government institutions. That's very, very important to identify here very quickly. So one, I will start off in some of those benchmarks just by identifying some of the activities that the Chicano movements, New Mexico's Black Berets, were involved in. I will say that that many of our members of the Black Berets, in some cases, came out of the Brown Beret organization. We do not necessarily come out of nonprofit movements. No discredit or disrespect to any nonprofit organizations, but we come out of liberation organizations. So we come out of the Chicana and Chicano liberation movement. So identifying then some of those key benchmarks. One is the intersections between what I'll say the Minutemen organization that has a long history here in New Mexico. And for some that don't know, that the leadership, one of the key leadership of the Minutemen organization in the 60s and the early 70s was housed in and lived in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. The reason why I'm making those intersections, because then when we look at that, many of the members or many of the officers within the Sheriff's Department, within APD, and then within the State Police Department were members of the Minutemen organization. So that's very, very important for us to understand in terms of this history. I think another benchmark for us to look at in terms of the Black Beret organization, and some would say, well, why did you call yourselves the Black Berets when you were a Chicana youth organization? And I would just flag very quickly that we made the decision during that time to call ourselves the Black Beret organization in honor of Ernesto Che Guevara and the both national and internationalism that Che was engaged and involved in. And so that's why we called ourselves the Black Berets. So let's just go into it just here for a quick minute. One, in terms of Albuquerque, it's important for us to understand that there was a moment in this history when where you look at the APD or the Sheriff's Department, that the APD could not come into the county. That's very, very important for those that are engaging in this. And we would always encourage folks to go back and look at and dive into the history. For those of us here, for example, that live in the South Valley, coming over the river here, then they could not cross over the river. APD could not cross over the river at that time to come into the county in any direction. That's important for us to understand. I think the other is when we look at the Black Berets spent the membership of the Black Beret organization were community members. And so New Mexicans and community members. And so then the Black Beret organization didn't only base itself out of the South Valley, although we did have an office here. They were also based all over the city of Albuquerque, from Martinez down to South Broadway, San Jose, Los Parillas, you name it, in the broader Albuquerque, in the Albuquerque area. So identifying that then we made a decision that if we were forming a youth organization, that it was crucial for us to engage with the community as community members and to get a sense from the community what they considered the primary issues as being. And so obviously one of those that came up as a top on that list was police repression. I'm saying that because for those that have read or that are knowledgeable of the Black Beret organization, we had very strong and powerful community support. But how did we actually get that community support? And that's what I want to identify again. We got it from what I say, the surveys that were done largely door to door, identifying issues. And so several other issues came up, the issue of childcare, the issue of unemployment, the issues of education, the issues of I mean, you name it, healthcare and whatever. So we decided then, and for many of you that know, we opened up the first community-run health clinic in 1968 in Albuquerque. We had several what we call liberation schools because our people identified childcare as an issue, but the lack of the history that was being taught, the correct history that was being taught within the Albuquerque public schools. So we had liberation schools for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, and we had them in the North Valley, we had them in the downtown area, and we also had them in the South Valley. We had 5 liberation schools for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. We opened up, for example, the first wood cooperative Many of our people were heating and eating off of wood, and we formed a wood cooperative. We had movie night. We had various activities. We provided food. We opened up the first breakfast program to feed our young sisters and brothers, our children, before they went to school. The reason why I'm saying that interaction with the community is when that lacks, that interaction with the community, then that puts us in us speaking for someone else for without them speaking for themselves. And so that's very, very important. The community support, the constant engagement of community members is very crucial to this process. I think the others, then, as I mentioned, liberation and liberation movements was the engagement between African-American, between Chicano, and the other various communities that existed around the city of Albuquerque. So there was a lot of engagement. And since we came from liberation movements, then there was also national engagement with the Black Panthers, with the American Indian Movement, with the Asian Pacific Islander liberation organizations, and as I said, AIM, the American Indian Movement, and other organizations nationally and internationally. That's very, very important for us to understand. So this just on some of the benchmarks then, one, we need to understand that in the population where we live, then the repression, the various forms of oppression that was taking place at that point, and the power of the people coming forward, then there was within the police departments, they formed what was called the Metro Squad. The Metro Squad was made up of the Albuquerque Police Department, the Sheriff's Department, and the State Police. Now, remember what I said earlier, that many of those officers, not all of them, but several of those officers that were part of the Minutemen organization were in these various institutions at that time. So then we seen repression, we seen brutality, we seen racial profiling, we seen all of those combinations of things that to a large extent that we're still seeing today. So that's very, very important for us to understand those benchmarks. I really encourage all of you that are listening and the students to look at New Mexico's history. New Mexico has a long history, and so that unintentionally, many times, that we're not allowing ourselves unintentionally, as I say, to pit us against each other. And so that's why I'm identifying African Americans, Native Indigenous, Chicano. And so it wasn't just a localized situation in Albuquerque. It was happening all over the state of New Mexico. The assassinations of our sisters and brothers, the assassination of Rito Canales and Antonio Cordova in January 29th of 1972, when two of our members were assassinated by the Albuquerque Police Department. But I want to tell you something, because even if we look back at the assassination of Bobby Garcia, that also took place, there was a student at the University of New Mexico. When we look back at that, the Minutemen organization were claiming credit during that time for the shootings and other activities that were taking place, not only in Albuquerque, but throughout the state. So there was that piece, there was the piece of engagement by the Metro Squad and those activities. Our cars were being blown up, our homes were being shot, they were brutalizing our people in the streets and so on. But that's very, very important. I would encourage you to read 500 Years of Chicano History, and then at the same time to read 500 Years of Chicana History, which identifies some of these moments. Ricardo Aracon, who was killed in southern New Mexico, in Oro Grande, New Mexico, from Taos to Santa Fe to Las Cruces, and then Gallup. Where's Gallup in Farmington and these areas, these additional areas that we're talking about, where Larry Casus was assassinated by the Gallup Police Department during that time. So it wasn't just a one ethnic group piece, and still isn't today. Repression is repression, and we're all being repressed in many, many different ways. So I don't want to go on. I know we have a series of things to do here, but I do want to say that when we're coming up with slogans or whatever, defund the police, with these kind of things, we need to be very, very crucial. We need to be very, very careful with how we do that, because many of our community members were coming back and saying, we don't believe that the police should be defunded. Some of the questions that Jennifer brought up earlier. So there needs to be constant engagement, not only with students at the university or other universities, and constant engagement with the community as we continue to move forward. So I'm going to close by just giving you some more quick examples. The riots that took place at the state penitentiary, because as we make those intersections, those riots that took place, as many know, it was the largest, what was considered larger to some extent at that level than Attica, and what took place at Attica during that time, that took place in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So when we make those intersections between the issues and those overlaps between those issues, then we're going to get what we said, that if we don't take care of some of these things, this is the consequence of what that is. So lastly, we set up a community patrol in the Blackberry organization, and we were asked by communities, and it was said to the communities, to the Sheriff's Department, the Albuquerque Police Department, you stay out of our communities, the Black Berets will come in and patrol our neighborhood, and they will respond to calls that we need to make. That's number one. Number two, we had people's tribunals. And some of the assassinations, some of the other brutalities, we set up different tribunals that were held in the North Valley and the South Valley and different locations where community members, religious leaders, and others sat on a tribunal and then heard the testimony, sometimes with our sisters and brothers with bags over their head because they could not identify themselves because the press was there and so on, and what the after result of that would be. So I want to kind of leave it there so we can kind of move on. I get upset about this.
Yeah, thank you,
I'm gonna be
Richard.
honest. I'm going to be honest, because at the end of the day, we've lost many of our sisters and brothers, and we're still losing them. So thank you, Holly, and I'll close it off there.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's infuriating. So we appreciate you bringing that energy to this. It's so important. So next we'll hear from David, and I hope folks saw the message in the chat about Q&As. Make sure you're writing down questions, and we'll get the Q&A function up and running towards the end of the event. But now we'll hear from David. Thank you so much again, Richard.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And I want to give a little shout out. I looked through the list of folks watching. Sue Skirman, who I organized with in 2014, and Keegan Clore, who I've been organizing with since the most recent uprisings, are watching. It's good to see their names. It's great to see Richard. I think I was thinking today, preparing for this, I think the last time I was on a panel talking about police with Richard was 2014. Richard, we were at the Peace and Justice Center. This was shortly after police murdered James Boyd, and the city erupted in anger, and there were 1,000 people in the streets the days after he was killed. And I was a part of a number of groups working to confront the crisis of police violence in our community. And you know, I've been thinking a lot about those years, 2014, 2015. And really what I want to talk about a little bit today is about, you know, how, sort of for me at least, the legacy of that time and the work I did with comrades then informed the work I was doing last year and up to now with a group called Abolish APD, which I formed with some comrades last year. You know, I guess it might as well just start with some numbers, right? Okay, I mean, you know, when Richard and I were on that panel at the Peace and Justice Center in 2014, police committed 21% of all homicides in Albuquerque and Bernalillo County that year. 21%, just under 21% of all homicides. Cops did that, okay? You know, I spent a lot of time in the months after the murder of James Boyd looking deeply into the police department. I had met Richard years before, so I understood that longer history in the 60s and 70s, which he just talked about, which is so crucially important to understand. Let me bring that up to the 80s, okay? So between 87 and 97, Albuquerque police killed 32 people. And those killings provoked a crisis, like it always does in every community around the country when police go on these killing sprees. And it resulted in a wave of reform. There was a new community oversight commission created, standards around training and hiring. They brought in new leadership. And in the 6 years after that, they actually increased the rate at which they killed people, killing, I think it was about 23 people in the 6 years after 1997. um, there was no pause in that, but I think generally the way people counted, to point out that between like 2010 and 2015, leading up to the murder of James Boyd, which really erupted with so much anger in the city, Albuquerque police killed upwards of 30 people. And then I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the waves of reform that followed, starting in 2015, when the city of Albuquerque and the Albuquerque Police Department were forced by the federal courts to enter into a consent decree that certainly didn't place them under receivership, but it placed them under scrutiny and also sent them through a series of reforms that I think inarguably constitute the greatest amount of reform any police department has ever gone through in the United States. And I've taught classes about this, and I've written books about police violence and police reform, and I can tell you, no police department has ever gone, even Camden, in which a police department was just disbanded and restarted, really hasn't been transformed the way this reform process forced them. And yet, since 2015, the most reformed police department in the United States, they've killed around 45 people. It's hard to keep track, actually, because the killing, we have to check the paper every day. So what I want to tell you here is what police reformists will not say, which is that police reform doesn't fix police. Police reform fixes you and me to shore up the legitimacy of police. Every single police reform process in the United States that has happened at either the federal level or the city level or the state level always results in more cops on the street, more guns in their hands, and more money in their budgets. That's what police reform does. There's not a single example of a police department that went through the federal consent decree process, the Department of Justice, that didn't complete with more cops, more money, and more weapons. That's what police reform does, okay? Police reform is really about shoring up the legitimacy of police and not at all about resolving the problems that we identify all over the country. There's one problem, I think, and I think it really is the key motivation that led to the creation of Abolish APD, which was that the focus in 2014 and 2015 was about fatal police violence, right? The lethality of the Albuquerque Police Department, which is undoubtedly among the most lethal police departments in the United States and has been for generations. But it's impossible to get numbers on anything other than that, right? Now, we don't know the sort of day-to-day grinding harassment that APD unleashes in our community because they control the data, right? They're the ones doing the counting. They're the ones holding that data. When Dr. Ginger, the federal monitor, came to the city, I met with him and I asked him, how are you going to get the data you're going to use to evaluate APD? And he said, well, we're going to get the data from the Albuquerque Police Department. And I asked, is there any plan to go out on the street to talk to folks on the street? And he said, we're not permitted to do that. He was actually basically appointed by the court. And so the court determined what he could and couldn't do. And he was prohibited from doing that. So, and the lack of that information, right, means that what we know about police comes to us from police. Everything we think we know about cops outside of our own personal interactions with them comes to us filtered through their language, their arguments, their allies. And it's a language of law and order. It's a language of public safety. It's a language that makes sense to a lot of people who are anxious, a lot of people who see their interests bound up in the interests of police. Even people who aren't. I've talked to many people all the time about defunding or abolishing police, and who will I call? They ask, and despite a conversation about like, well, have you ever called and what was the outcome? Always leading to, well, it didn't really help, or it actually was worse. That doesn't seem to convince some people that abolishing police sends us to a safer world, and we'll talk about that in this session today. But I want to talk a little bit about what we tried to do in Abolish APD about that. Reformists co-opted us in 2014 and 2015, right? They made a bunch of promises, people felt safe again, and then police went on their killing spree. So in 2020, when we formed Abolish APD, we decided we need to figure out a way to gather information about police that doesn't rely on police. And so we did it in two ways. We went out on the street and did street research, talking to folks who are constantly dealing with cops. And the people who are constantly dealing with cops are unsheltered folks all over the city. And so we went out as often as we could, once, twice a week. We were doing mutual aid. So we were distributing water, food, any supplies, survival supplies that people needed. And then we just talked to them. What's going on? What's happening? And they told us, we found out about police practices through folks on the street. And then we took that information that we got from folks on the street and we traced it through the court records. Because while I don't trust anything cops tell me about what they do and what they think they do, I trust what they say to the courts, right? Because it's a record of what they've done. We arrested this person, we cited this person, this is where they were, this is when it happened, this is what I did, although they often aren't complete in their descriptions of their actions. And it was only because of that the combination of like collecting our own data on police practices and police operations, paired with listening to the only people that I think matter are the people that are being policed on the street on a daily basis, to figure out what cops are doing. And so we're not completely done with that database, but I wanted to give you a bit of an idea about what we found. And again, this is just brief, and I can answer more questions in Q&A if you want. But you may recall at the beginning of the pandemic, the police said, we're not going to arrest anyone on misdemeanors anymore. We're only going to issue citations. Well, it turns out they were actually already by the court required to do that. By the McClendon Agreement, which the APD signed, they cannot arrest anyone on a nonviolent misdemeanor unless there are some circumstances that require it. And of course, the police determine what requires an arrest. But then the interim police chief Medina played up the idea that we care about people and we don't want to send them to prison during the COVID, so we're just going to be giving citations. So we traced those citations through the courts and we realized that they were giving in citations in absentia to people who live on the street, who don't have an address, who don't have a phone number. And those citations were turning into bench warrants. And those people were being arrested then and going to jail. And they were giving citations to people who the courts had already said can't stand trial because they're not competent to stand trial, but the cops continue to give them citations. Those continue to turn into bench warrants, and they continue to be arrested and went to jail. And they know that all those unsheltered folks couldn't afford to pay the fines and fees that went along with those bench warrants for those misdemeanors. And so they were jailed in lieu of fines and fees. So, and this was constant. The New Mexico, the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission asked me to give them a brief presentation a few months ago about APD's treatment of Native people. And I looked through some of our data, and I just want to give you an idea. About 40% of all cases filed by APD in January and February of last year were filed against unsheltered people, 40%. The idea that the community safety department is going to protect us by sending social workers out instead of cops disguises a very key fact here, which is that most of the contacts between cops and anyone they come into contact with are not contacts that begin with a call to 911. They're just cops on patrol and on the beat and rolling up on people. That's how most of those contacts happen. And we could trace that through the records. 100% of all shoplifting arrests in the city are started by private security. The private security at Kohl's, for example, in the mall, actually fills out all of the arrest warrants for people, and then the cops just file it for them. 80% of all shoplifting citations happen at Walmart, Kohl's, and Target. In 40% of shoplifting criminal cases, APD arrested people or cited them never having actually come into contact with them. They were doing it in absentia, just relying on these private security guards to tell them what they were doing and filing these reports. And 11% of all cases with Native people, cops never came into contact with them, cited them, and every one of those people went to jail for missing that court date. 20% of all shoplifting cases involved alleged thefts valued less than $10. We found citations and even arrests for shoplifting cases on alleged thefts less than $1.50. The Albuquerque Police Department is organized around the harassment of unsheltered people. That's what they do. They're very good at it. They do it constantly. If you go on the street and talk to people, that's That's what they know. That's their life. In fact, it usually takes quite a bit of time to sort of talk to folks to get the stories, because to them, it's like, well, this is just a normal story. There's a few unique things. For example, they give a lot of rough rides, grab young Native men in particular off the streets and haul them to Isleta or 9 Mile Hill and dump them, sometimes beating them when they do that. Reform doesn't solve this. There's no redeeming this, and there's no reforming it. And I hope we can have a conversation about how we find alternatives to this the rest of the session. So
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. And we'll hear now from Szu-Han. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah, thank you. And to all the organizers and to other panelists. I'm really happy to be here. I'm Szu-Han Ho, and pronouns are she or they, and here as a member of Fronteristas with my colleagues, Bernardine Hernandez, Hazel Batres Chavez, and Martin Wanam. We are artists. And I also teach at UNM. I was born in Taiwan. I have grown up in Texas and lived in New Mexico, been privileged to live in New Mexico for about 11 years. And I came to abolition through immigrant justice organizing. So just through my own personal connection to immigration and mixed status, I came to work with the pro bono lawyers going to Cibola Detention Center, which was the detention center, immigrant detention center run by CoreCivic, a for-profit corporation with the only pod for trans people in the country. So I saw there, and through my students and through that experience, saw firsthand, the ugly sort of face of the prison industrial complex and policing and ICE. And so organizing through that led me to abolition. And I think I'll just say also that it's been an evolution. I think I'm always learning and trying to listen to community, trying to understand more about the situation. And I think it is important for us to kind of be humble and sort of walk in humility amongst community and people most impacted. So Fronteristas is an arts collective. We work on prison abolition, police abolition, and migrant justice. I have some slides I can show because we're artists and we're really visual. I would love to be able to do that. I won't go through everything, but this kind of gives you an idea. We formed in 2018. Bernardine Hernandez and I co-founded the collective, started organizing artists in the borderlands, and then really kind of intensified our work in 2020. Hazel and Martin joined us, and we've been partnering with community organizers, different coalitions. I can name them here: Prison Divest New Mexico, People's Budget New Mexico, Anti-War Albuquerque, Free Them All Coalition, and several others. So we utilize creative direct action. I think, feel like the role of artists in this conversation is important. We don't, as artists, always feel essential or vital, but I think we bring, sort of, I think doing this work involves creativity, right? And this panel in particular is about imagining a police-free future. And I think that failure of imagination has gotten to where we are today, with the only way that we know how to deal with our problems is punishing people and policing people and locking them up. So we definitely need a revolution in our imaginations. I'm going to show a few images. And I'll try to also keep track of my time limit. So this is a social media website. Last year, as the pandemic really hit, we're mobilizing for folks inside because of the intense risk, danger to people who are incarcerated in migrant detention centers, jails, prisons. So we staged a number of actions, and we really, like, knowing that it wasn't necessarily safe, or we didn't feel safe creating a big in-person protest or a call to action in that way. We specifically staged this for online circulation. So we staged kind of like a photo shoot, and it was interesting because we showed up to the jails and detention centers telling the guards, you know, we're here for a photo shoot and it's an art project. And that it's amazing what you can get away with when you tell people that it's just an art project. So this is at MDC. We worked with White Coats for Black and Indigenous Lives, so group of doctors who were equally super concerned about people inside, and also worked with a group called Anonymous Untitled on this direct intervention on the sculpture at the State Roundhouse. So we created a situation with the tug of war sculpture where, you know, one side is freeing the other side. And a little close up here. And we've also hosted banner making workshops and banner drops. So really finding ways to get people together around art making and sort of feel a sense of agency in our immediate environment. So this was a banner drop on I-40. That was a result of a workshop to get people together to paint, to sew, and to, it was really quite like exciting and moving because we were coming, like it was still summer 2020, so lockdown and isolation, and being able to get together outside and paint was kind of, it was so liberatory. And then hanging these banners, they went down immediately. I think police got called in immediately and took these banners down, but we did manage to get the photos. Other big banner drops that we've done in support of this campaign, outside of Sanitary Tortilla Factory, downtown Albuquerque, we hung this 15-foot banner with the Angela Davis quote, "Prisons don't disappear social problems, they disappear human beings." And this was also connected to our work with Prison Divest New Mexico. So we, with the coalition, pushed for the divestment of our pension funds, educator pension funds in New Mexico, so that they're controlled by the NMERB, the Educational Retirement Board, which we found out had investments in private prisons, Core Civic and GEO Group. And we, together with the coalition, pushed, got petitions, unions, letters from school boards, and successfully, I'm happy to report, compelled the NMERB to divest our funds from those private prison companies. And that is really like a big win for us, but it's also just the tip of the iceberg when you start to realize how extensive and pervasive and the tentacles of the prison industrial complex. So a lot of our work also is aimed at how can we engage people who might not really know a lot or be interested in, or they might even be turned off by this messaging. So a lot of times the art is a way to create that engagement. And so we were able to put up 7 billboards. This was funded by the Art for Justice Fund. And we wanted to work with local artists, New Mexico BIPOC artists. And we located these billboards around jails, prisons, detention centers around the state. So this is on I-25 on your way to Santa Fe. This is Josh Patterson. This is artist Marina Esquitz, a native artist. In this location was out by Grants. Marina is Dene. This is Vicente Tellez, and this billboard was located on I-40. Sorry, this location is incorrect right here. This is I-25 near Anthony, Texas, so near Las Cruces. This is Eric Garcia out near Moriarty. This is Yvette Serrano, I-25 near Los Lunas. This is Haley Greenfeather English, Indigenous artist. And this one was so polemic that the billboard companies refused to run it. They wouldn't tell us why. We really pressed for a reason and they just couldn't give us a reason. We figured it was, you know, a little bit too political to have these ICE agents, these cops, all of this content, even though it's like, you know, this sort of colorful, saturated, cartoonish image. So we turned it into a large banner, and this is hanging right now in downtown Albuquerque, outside and outside of El Chante Casa de Cultura. This is an artwork by a currently incarcerated artist, Ese Spook. And this was a really amazing experience working with Michael Armendariz. And he went through, you know, he's been incarcerated and for many, many years, and told us about the situation inside throughout the pandemic and throughout doing this project, like trying to get art supplies, you know, accepting for, you know, phone calls and trying to get healthcare. He did come down with COVID, and, you know, it was a hellish experience for him inside. We have an audio interview with him on our website if you're interested. Another project is that is political education oriented is our Free Them All zines. So the themes of our 4 zines are the impact of policing in the US, the prison industrial complex, immigration, and abolition. These are a really important part, I think, of what we're doing, just making these very cheaply produced, but highly researched documents that we can send out. And they also involve artwork and poetry, timelines of histories, essays. Yeah, so, and those are available at El Chante Casa de Cultura, if you're interested.
Awesome. Szu-Han, thank you so much. If you're okay to wrap up, we're going to pass it to Justin, if that's okay.
Yep.
And just a note on the Q&As, we're going to open up the chat to submit questions towards the end of Justin's, what Justin has to say. And so make sure you're writing those questions down. You'll be able to share them in just a bit, and we'll make sure to get to as many as we can. So thank you so much. And Justin, we'll hear from you next.
Thank you for the space and inviting me to this conversation. My name is Justin Allen. I grew up here in the South Valley, and I spent approximately 17 years, all my 20s and 30s, in the Mexico Department of Corrections behind nonviolent drug crimes under mandatory minimum laws. So any of us who have experienced incarceration and deemed a repeat offender or habitual offender by the state are living demonstrations that prisons do not work. Every time I was released, I came out worse off than I was before, and I repeated the same behavior that landed me there in the first place. I've struggled with substance abuse, and prisons do not rehabilitate. We assimilate to prison culture, which is counterproductive to remaining in society. Prison reinforces the punishment mindset and code of silence as we adopt beliefs as a means of survival, a certain set of beliefs as a means of survival. My theory of action and change is rejecting the punishment mindset and asserting ourselves politically despite being disenfranchised by law enforcement. Rejecting the punishment mindset means that I do not inflict harm on myself and others by continuing to engage in substance abuse, as I had to learn that the war on drugs is actually a war on race, class, and humanity. Rejecting the punishment mindset means that I seek alternatives to addressing harm that do not cause more harm. That means rejecting the systems that murder and imprison us and practicing transformative justice. Transformative justice shows up in my daily life as I navigate my relationships. Instead of doing unto others what has been done to me, I treat everyone the way I would want to be treated. So changing the carceral system involves changing narratives that legitimize state violence and mass incarceration. How we talk about ourselves and others is critical to changing these narratives. Therefore, it is necessary to refrain from using words like felon, criminal, ex-convict, or illegal to describe ourselves and others. As these labels are internalized, we act accordingly. A more intentional framework of language is required to dismantle narratives that legitimize state violence. For example, instead of using those terms, we use language that describes the human condition in relation to state violence, or in relation to mass incarceration and the evolution of slavery. Prisoner, detainee, returning citizen, and undocumented are more accurate words to describe the condition of human beings who are subjects of state violence, the prison industrial complex, or immigration customs enforcement. As the public begins utilizing this shared transformative language, we begin exposing the violence of the prison industrial complex that has been obscured and legitimized by white supremacy. Once the public has adopted the shared transformative language, they become effective advocates in changing the carceral system. Changing the carceral system involves standing against harmful policy and legislation that expands the criminal punishment system. For example, mandatory minimums, criminal enhancements, hate crime legislation, and immigration enforcement are examples of policies that expand the prison industrial complex. In contrast, the public can support policy and legislation that invests in humanity rather than throwing people away. I would say that the experience of incarceration definitely changed my perception of police and prisons. Prior to incarceration, I was conditioned to believe that police and prisons were the solution to public safety. What I've learned is that police and prisons have the effect of manufacturing so-called criminals by stripping our voice and subjecting us to mental, physical, and sexual abuse. And speaking out about these injustices result in further punishment. I personally endured all these abuses at the hands of prison staff. My only recourse at the time was to continue to engage in substance abuse and accept those abuses as part of my prison sentence. Eventually, we get released into society with those defense mechanisms that allowed us to survive, and our reaction to the world is perceived as a threat. Police and prisons condition us to become reactive and engage in self-defeating behaviors that result in recidivism. We become products of the prison industrial complex through a process of assimilation. When I first got involved in abolition was inside the walls. We watched a documentary called The House I Live In, and it really opened my eyes to the injustices that happen, or this very intentional system in place. When I got out in 2015, I got out only to be re-indicted on a charge that had been previously dismissed, and I was facing 18 years, another 18 years in prison. I had to go to trial twice to be found not guilty. During that fight for my life was the 2016 presidential election, and I was horrified about what I saw happening as white supremacy began showing itself in our community. I couldn't vote due to felon disenfranchisement, so I started engaging in protests and acts of civil disobedience, which soon became criminalized and dangerous under the Trump administration. When I first broke the silence about the injustices that were happening to me was at a Millions for Prisoners rally in 2017. I spoke about the abuse that I endured, and I finally got my voice back and began advocating for others behind the walls who have endured similar abuses. Since then, I've been an active member in the community. I graduated UNM with a bachelor's in American Studies last May. And it really empowered me to advocate for myself and others. Prior to educating myself, I didn't have the vocabulary to explain the things that I saw and experienced in a way that was not so reactive. Abolition for me has become a way of life. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of understanding things, and it's liberation. Abolition is how I took control of my life again. And so I wouldn't be here today had I not come to understand abolition for what it is. I thank you all for having me here in this conversation.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much, Justin. And thank all the speakers for being here. Kerry just noted in the chat that the chat is now open for questions. I'm going to take this opportunity to ask the first question here to all of the panelists. You all mentioned different ways that you have worked to create different kinds of research. David mentioned some data that represents the scale of the violence of APD. Szu-Han talked about the role of art in this, and Richard really talked about the importance of knowing our histories and the ways that we don't find those things in the institutions that we're typically a part of, whether it's like public education or otherwise. And I'm wondering how you see this independent or non-institutional research as a way to respond to sort of like common discourse or common logic that might be concerned about recent crime waves, or someone who worries about like the unpopularity of a phrase like, how the unpopularity of a phrase like defund the police might hurt the democratic election. Basically just asking you to articulate sort of the importance of this independent or alternative forms of research and the role that plays in abolition. And that question's open to anyone.
Okay, well, I think one, is to say, and I think David made this comment earlier, the role particularly around the research is crucial, and David touched on that, and that the role that students play in developing that research and interacting with those that are being researched is very, very, very crucial with that in terms of gathering that particular data, because you ain't going to get it from them. And so I think that point was made very, very clear. I think the other, though, I will say, and then pass it on to the other panelists, is that the role of the institution at the University of New Mexico. And that's very, very, very crucial. And so based upon that, then we would know at the end of the day, as we refer to it as the glass castle on the hill, that the institution, but now we can see with some of the earlier comments when the introductions were made, the various classes and so on that have been taking place. So that's very, very important. And then lastly, the interaction between what work is being done at the university and then the community at the same time. We've got to be cautious at the end of the day. We've got to be cautious, and we need to engage the community at all levels.
Maybe I'll go next if no one minds. This is a tough one because it's such a big question, really. I mean, it's not just a question of doing that research, but it's disseminating it. I think Szu-Han, her presentation about art, I mean, disseminating that, making it land and really resonating people is so important. I mean, I realized, the numbers I gave you earlier about the lethality of the Albuquerque Police Department, I mean, that's a spiel I've been saying for like 10 years, and facts don't seem to matter when it comes to police. There's not a single reform process that results in anything reformers promise us at the beginning of those reform processes, and yet they're never challenged that way when reform begins, right? And the problem, of course, and the real reason why reform is so compelling is because we're left with no alternative. I mean, when people balk at the idea of defunding police or abolishing police, it's largely because they wonder, well, what will I do? Who will I turn to? And these are people that haven't been in positions that that give them sort of that clear that clearly let them know that there's nothing good's coming out of this, and even people who've had bad experiences with police, I mean, are still sort of like locked into this. Well, there's no alternative, so we have to fix what we have. And so I think at least one of the ways that we have to do it is we have to stop thinking about police, or I mean, one way to think about this maybe is to maybe broaden our conception of police. Police is not just a department with uniformed officers with guns, right? This is a particular power that's diffused through the state, right? The police powers are diffused through the state, and wherever you see a state agency at any scale that relies on coercion to meet its goals, then you're confronting police. That's what police is, right? That coercion, the violence or the threat of violence. And so confronting this sort of coercive state apparatuses and recognizing that they're diffused throughout the state, but even beyond it, right? Because one of the things that we were doing with Abolish APD was really focusing on the role of private security and working with police, particularly around arrests related to alleged shoplifting. And I mean, this alone is an ocean of data that was just beyond our ability to acquire, because we just don't. I mean, we're not getting. Target Corporation is not giving us any of the information from their 2 state-of-the-art forensics labs. Target Corporation is not giving us the information from the dozens of databases they've set up with police departments around the country and all the money they've seeded. And none of these security guards are going to talk to us, and we're not going to find out any of that information. There's this public-private apparatus of policing in this country that's shocking. And you know, the Albuquerque Police Department has a budget of about almost $250 million a year, but that's one of like 7 police departments in Bernalillo County. I mean, we're talking about UNM, APS, open space, the Metropolitan Municipal Development Division of the city of Albuquerque has its own police department. The airport has its own police department. Almost every federal agency has active agents in town. We're just awash in cops in Albuquerque, in every community. And so, and if that's true, right? I mean, this is another thing when it comes to data. If that's true, then why is this sort of constant drumbeat about crime never laid at the feet of the system of policing we have? If there's a problem with public safety, it's certainly not one that police can fix. And if we honestly look at the data, if we have the sort of courage of our convictions to reach the real conclusions here, we'd have to conclude that actually police produce the insecurity and the violence in our communities that we fear. So that's the legacy of police, and it's Abolish APD is a very small group, a collective trying to do as much as we can. But the thing that crack here is this sort of like the idea of there's no alternative. We haven't cracked that yet, and that's the thing we have to figure out, like how to reach people that we haven't.
This is a great transition to our next question. I'm looking at sort of what folks are asking, people imagining what does a post-police Albuquerque look like or post-police world look like? And then someone asked, what are some alternatives? Like you said, I mean, I think it's this thinking of the scale of the abolition of police or the abolition of capitalism as it connects to police and carceralism generally. These are big things to wrap our minds around. And I'm wondering what examples of people practicing abolition or on any scale inspires anyone here. Yeah.
I can jump in. I'm most inspired by the work of, that I see in the community organizing, that, people like Richard has said that people have organized community defense, since back at least in the 60s and 70s, and people are doing it now. Mutual aid, shout out AVQ Mutual Aid, Millions for Prisoners. I consider all of these groups working together to be creating abolitionist futures, like in the present. So we're figuring out ways to negotiate conflict, manage sort of harm or repair harm. And I think like what Justin mentioned, the transformative justice piece is huge for me too. Like we have to start within ourselves individually and how we relate to all the people in our lives. So I think we can start at that level. Just like, how do we actually create the conditions for addressing harm?
Yeah, Justin, please share if you have any responses to the question as well.
Yeah, so everyday abolitionist practice for me is rejecting the punishment mindset daily in both my words and actions. When I'm wronged by another individual, I seek ways to address the harm in a way that repairs my relationship rather than seeking vengeance. On the other hand, if I unintentionally harm someone else, I immediately take steps to correct my mistake and maintain my relationship with them by acknowledging my fault and make an effort to make amends. Abolitionist practice involves a certain amount of cultural humility and seeking ways to understand root causes of harm rather than attributing harm to individual shortcomings. Usually harm is the result of an individual's needs not being met or other underlying issues. A quote by Brian Stevenson says, "Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done." In remembering this quote, we're able to acknowledge our humanity as well as the humanity of others. Abolitionist practice is literally an investment in humanity that doesn't require policing and other violent reactions to harm. So even after we transform these systems, crime and harm will still exist. I conceptualize addressing harm through community accountability that maintains a standard of values and recognizing every individual as a valuable community member. When every community member feels valued and has a sense of belonging, they're less likely to inflict harm on themselves and others. When somebody does inflict harm on another person, we treat it as a mistake that can be corrected by teaching the individual about the harm the community has endured. When we throw people away as punishment, we send the message that mistakes cannot be corrected and rehabilitation is impossible. So community accountability involves members helping individuals transform harmful behavior while providing safety and support to members who have been harmed. Our connection to one another as a community gives each one of us a sense of responsibility and obligation to one another that promotes public safety.
I think that, just in response to that, but I just have to flag a comment that David made. For us that live here in the community, we've got what we call smokestack police. That's the ones that patrol the streets and put their flashlights up to see if we're burning our wood stoves or whatever on a no burn night. Immigration, Sheriff's Department, APD, the state police, and on, since we live close to the river and so on. And then that connection. I think that some of the, in relationship to that question, some of that is somewhat beginning to happen. And so what I mean by that is that as busy as we all are at the end of the day, and our family work and our organizational work and so on, we've got to open up our lines of communications. And that's very, 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 very crucial. Because we're still going to talk about self-determination. We're going to continue to discuss the same language that we were discussing 50 years ago or whatever. And I'm just going to flag again the history. We've got to make a commitment to understand the history of New Mexico. And when I say that, let's be cautious that life didn't begin when we got involved. Then even for us, we need to keep that in mind. So we're talking a little bit about the 60s now. I know there's been additional research and so on, but we need to talk about the 50s, the 40s, and all the other kind of stuff that goes along with it. But the communications is the crucial part of that to me, is just opening up ourselves, being supportive, communicating, developing strategies together, and then engagement and discussions. And I said statistics lastly, just to say, is that our folk know, that 2 people were killed yesterday, or this kind of thing, whatever. But when we see those actual numbers in practice, that's very important as a reminder, because our people are going through so many things consistently every day. So that research, which is difficult, getting that information out is very, very crucial. And I wanted to thank our sister for putting up some of the billboards and so on, because we cannot forget, as we won't, theater, music, art, and our other political cultural workers in helping to move it forward.
Can I add something to that after Richard? That was great, Richard. Thank you. I was like looking at a few of the comments and questions being listed here, and I think it might be useful to just, there's nothing inevitable about police and prisons. There's nothing eternal about police and prisons. Policing, as we know it, was largely an accumulation strategy by capital to control a working class in the North and an enslaved population in the South in this country. It was reshaped in the early part of the 20th century to produce an industrial order that could accommodate industrialization, right? So the police we have is not a police we've always had. It's a very specific kind of police that produces a very specific kind of order. I want to point out, and this is, I think, for people who write about police, police had been a backwater forever. I mean, only criminologists wrote about police. Police were just considered boring. Police were self-evident, right? And really, it's only in the last 20, 30 years, particularly last, I would say 15, 10 years, that police have become an object of interest to like critical scholars, radical scholars. And I think if we learn anything from that work, what we've learned is that police fabricate social and economic order. Police don't, they certainly do protect it and defend that order, but without police, there is not an industrial and social order that serves the interests of capital and patrols the racial lines in this country. It's not, right? So there's a reason why we're talking about abolishing police and abolishing prisons when it's true, and some of the comments have said it. What we're talking about are larger systems of oppression and repression, right? And so it's not an accident, of course, that police constantly focus on property crimes and police constantly focus on quality of life. The Albuquerque Police Department doesn't solve crimes, okay? There is no crime that Albuquerque police solve. That's not what they do. They're imposing order on the city, an order that serves the interests of certain people. And that's the question we should be asking. In whose interest does the order that police impose serve?
Right.
And if we can identify that, then we can identify where to confront that system, knowing all the while that there's nothing inevitable about police and prisons, and there's nothing eternal about it, and that our organizing and our work on producing alternatives to police and confronting the police we have can transform that. That's the only way we can do it. And I personally rely a lot. I'm influenced by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And her argument is that abolition is not an absence, right? Abolition is a presence, right? A presence of real care in our community, the presence of a community that's not built on punishment. It's not a punitive coming together or a punitive collective. And I think that's the kind of thing that at least that, to be honest with you, wasn't really a part of the organizing in 2014 as much as it has been in the last year and a half. And that's a remarkable shift in just those 6-7 years. And I think that tells us something about this direction we're going in. That momentum and that work is making a difference and building the alternatives that we need to abolish police and prisons.
I want to thank everyone for the really thoughtful comments and questions in the chat. And David stole my Ruth Wilson Gilmore quote that I was going to close out with, unfortunately. But I want to, we have about 10 minutes left. And I know there are some announcements, been some calls to action here, but also some folks in the chat asking about what are alternatives. And so I'm going to sort of, I guess, wrap up and then sort of ask each panelist to, as quickly as concisely as possible, describe like what is something future thinking that you are or what's something that you're doing as briefly as possible to build that future, that abolitionist future for yourself. And then I'll call in Szu-Han and Jennifer to give some announcements. But what I was going to say is that Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about abolitionist presence, its life and rehearsal. And I think that one way that we rehearse this is by engaging in the radical practice of political imagination. And we hope that you leave this talk tonight with some encouragement to imagine more broadly. And as Justin said, it matters greatly how we talk about one another and about ourselves. So we encourage you to see all the ways that we interact with one another in the world around us as opportunities to rehearse abolition. And so with that, I'm going to invite folks as briefly as possible again to talk talk about how they're imagining that and what actions they're taking. So maybe let's start with Justin, Richard, and then we'll go to David. And then I know that Szu-Han and Jennifer have more announcements. So thanks so much.
So I think alternative to police and policing is community-based programs. The current prison diversion program should be community-based rather than funded by law enforcement. Almost 2 years ago, the city of Albuquerque implemented the Rapid Accountability Diversion Program, or RAD. It's funded by Albuquerque Police Department. This RAD program has proven to be ineffective because APD refuses to implement restorative justice. The RAD program has only had one referral since it began 2 years ago, and the program is only intended for adolescents. We should be skeptical of any so-called restorative justice program that is funded by law enforcement. True transformative justice and restorative justice practice must be community-based, because law enforcement is a violent system that doesn't even believe in these practices. Also, the recent Metro Crime Initiative, MCI, implemented by the city of Albuquerque, promises to fund violence intervention program, expand violence intervention program statewide, and bring restorative justice to schools. These initiatives sound good to the public, but they're actually funding for police and not community-based. If we want to truly implement initiatives that reduce harm and crime, we should be investing in community rather than other law enforcement approaches.
Yeah. And I just wanted to just follow up and not repeat anything Justin said, because that was an excellent list that he went through. And so from our perspective, I say from Los Jardines and the other groups that we engage in, it's really partially about making our communities whole again. And this issues that we're talking about, and that list that Justin went through, nothing, if we don't move to lift up our educational issues and so on, educating each other, working together. So it's really about community control. And so that's easier said than actually seeing it happen in practice. Systemic racism took hundreds of years to develop and implement, and we're not going to make all these changes overnight. So we just have to celebrate and be supportive of many of the community issues that have already been brought up and examples have been used. We should not allow ourselves to speak for others, and others do perfectly fine speaking for themselves. And that's many of the community issues, but it's about building and making our community whole again. That's a piece of what it is. And this issue that we're engaged in is a part of that struggle and the continuation of that.
This is always a difficult issue to articulate, because the police and prisons we have are pretty clear about what they are and what they claim they'll do, whereas abolition offers an alternative world that we have to build, and that's less specific. That's because abolition is not imagined an authoritarian world like the one we live in now with police and prisons. We live in an authoritarian world dominated by police and prisons, and we want one that's not authoritarian, which by definition means we're not going to be dictating to our comrades and friends and family and neighborhoods how they should live and what standards we're going to judge them by. but we're going to have to do that collectively. And that takes an enormous amount of work, and it's an organizing challenge. And it requires education, organizing. I think, but one of the things that depending on the audience that I'm talking to, one of the things I could say is, if I'm talking to like a middle-class white audience, I'm going to say you already live lives in which the police have been abolished largely. You're free from, you're not worried about cops when you drive somewhere. You're not worried about cops when you walk down the street. You're not worried about what's going to happen to your son or daughter when they go out by a cop. We need that world for everybody, right? And that requires then confronting questions around race and class, gender, and all the oppressions that go along with that. And those are not easy things. And those are organizing challenges that I cannot predict in advance how they'll turn out and what they'll come up with. And you want that. I don't want this world dictated by any one person, particularly a cop.
So I think one way, again, we have to interrupt our own thinking, like equating justice with punishment, is through education, right? And art is a bonus. So fronteristxs is creating this, what we're calling the CARE curriculum. And it's for youth. It's an art and transformative justice curriculum. And we're playing with the DARE, sort of war on drugs, for anybody who's that generation remembers that program in schools. So it's a CARE program. And it's about like talking about conflict and handling harm and building, like repairing relationships with each other so that we can not rely on this punishment mentality. So that's a project we're working on that's an active alternative right now. And we would love to see it, repeated, experimented with, like Miriam Kaba was quoted at the beginning. And I always think about her, like calling for 1 million experiments. We have to all try. Like these people in this panel are doing things, but we're all responsible for making attempts at creating this world that we're describing, a police-free world. So that project is with Working Classroom and SWAP.
And is there an action folks can take today around that?
Not around that specifically, but we do have an action. So just Jennifer mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that there is this proposal on the books. Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham is proposing $100 million additional for police. And, so while we're building the abolitionist futures, we don't want more money to the police. People are worried about the crime, worried about the increase in violent crime. As we've heard on the panel already, like police cause more violence and trauma. They're not going to change. They're not going to fix this problem. So there's a petition that I will share with you all and put in the chat. And this is about addressing legislation that is coming up in January, this coming January. This bit.ly link is NM_allege_care not cops. So telling the governor, telling state legislature not to invest in communities. Basically, we want community investment in, not investment in more cops. And there's not just this bill, the $100 million, but there are other bills like a domestic terrorism bill that expands the police power to decide what is terrorism, other expansion of policing bills. So we're trying to send a message of to oppose all of those pro-policing bills.
Thanks for sharing that, Szu-Han. And also check out all those resources in the link tree. There's also a resource put up by the People Budget of resources you can access instead of calling the police. And I also want to pitch a class that I'm teaching next term called Culture, Place, and Power. We'll be studying democratic practice, belonging, and community building. And there'll be an opportunity to do a community engagement project with the People's Budget. And the people, both Szu-Han and Justin, are connected to the people's budget. So one of the great things about these community engagement classes is that we get to learn and practice together with community members. And so I'm excited to just really thank all the panelists for their sharing their wisdom, expertise, and insight. Thank you so to all the audience members, those of you who asked questions, those of you who didn't. If we didn't get to your question, we're really sorry, but I'm just really inspired by the conversation that is both has a critical analysis adequate to the complexity of these social dynamics and is also willing to think big and bold about the kind of future we can build together. Great, so I think we are right on time, so we'll wrap it up. Do we need to say anything else before we head out?
I think we'll make sure the questions get saved and that there's a recording of the this is recorded and there'll be a transcript available. And so folks can share this conversation with people who weren't able to be here or reference it. Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Helen. I think that's the
That's
last.
exactly what I was gonna say. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you, everybody, for making the time to come.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
So
Thank
good to see you.
Let's stay in touch.
Community action folks, can we hang around and chat, or how do we do this? Little debrief.
Thank you to the organizers.
Thank
Good
you,
to see you
Szu-Han.
all.
Richard, it was really great to meet you.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for telling those stories and giving us those concrete examples of community,
Richard,
the community work of the Black Berets.
Richard, we also had some questions specifically for you regarding the history. And so I'm hoping I can follow up with you on an email and maybe get some resources to share with people. Would that be okay?
Oh, that's fantastic. And I just wanted to thank, before I go off, I just wanted to thank you all. An incredible job. Struggle continues and we're going to keep engaging ourselves in the struggle. So
Yeah,
let's stay in touch with each other and work with each other. So thank you very much.
That's wonderful.
yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
I look forward to collaborating. Dr. Tucker, I think we should maybe start a new
Great.
Zoom.
So I'm just trying to save the chat before we,
Great.
maybe I could do a breakout room or something. I'm actually going to stop recording.
Yeah.
Okay.
Please, yeah, please hold, sorry.